So my name is Brandon Jones. I'm a psychotherapist and behavioral health consultant in the Twin Cities. Born and raised in St. Paul. Grew up from a household what I call full of trauma and drama. The trauma that I experienced was a lot of domestic violence. When I go out and speak, train, or work with clients, I talk a lot about trauma. I'm kind of well known in the cities for trauma. And the way that I define trauma is a deep emotional wound, and trauma looks different for different people, especially in different communities and how they address trauma. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of go through. Not a lot of us, and we're kind of concentrated in certain pockets throughout the city. Mainly right now, I would say East St. Paul has the biggest representation of African Americans in St. Paul. Before that, it would have been what's considered the Frogtown area, you know, mainly kind of identified with being close to the Capitol, you know, University and Dale Street, things like that. And then also, historically, the Rondo neighborhood, which is, you know, identified between Lexington, Selby, and probably Western would kind of be the Rondo area, and then kind of capsulized by Summit. So that's the African American population for the most part. One thing that is interesting and separates us from a lot of other African American communities within the United States is that we also do have an immigrant population of black folks from Africa as well. Cultures are very different, but a lot of times we are lumped into the same thing, and I think that that's something that we have to be mindful of when we talk about mental health and when we talk about treating people who are classified as black, because there are some cultural nuances that are different. A lot of issues around relationships is huge, a lot of issues around stress, and a lot of things that can tie back to social economic class is huge too, just not having a lot of resources or access to things that leads to other health concerns, whether it's mental health or physical health concerns. A lot of what I call fragile family dynamics as well, a lot of pieced together families, you know, not a lot of those core nuclear American dream type families where you have mom, dad, 2.5 kids and a dog. Not a lot of that going on in the black community for various different reasons. And it's not to say that it needs to be like that, but in this system that we live in, that is the archetype of a family that is going to kind of keep you stable. Kind of doesn't mean that you're not going to be stable if you don't have it, but that's kind of the archetype that sets up this whole idea of American dream, and we could talk more about that as well. But in order for communities to kind of operate, that's kind of the standard that we look at in America. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great for stress.
Yeah, stress.
Relationship.
Yeah, stress in relationships. And when I say stress, I'm not talking about just, you know, having a bad day because your kids are getting on your nerves. I'm talking about these prolonged things that we would consider to be toxic stress. So, you know, seeing domestic violence, living in a neighborhood where there's a lot of break-ins or a lot of police, you know, policing going on, just policing in general, where you see 4 or 5 different squad cars a day. Living in a neighborhood where you don't have a relationship with your neighbors because you don't trust them. This is the type of stress that I'm talking about. And then that couples with, you know, your kids, you know, getting on your nerves. It couples with, you know, arguing with your partner. It couples with all these other things, but the level of toxic stress that is in the black community is alarming, and I think that is actually what stems a lot of the emotional and mental health issues that we do see and have. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The main ones that I see with my African American clients is usually dealing just with their basic trauma. I mean, it's hard to give it a mental health diagnosis because I think it's just a cultural thing that we struggle with, is that we get to the point where we're confused. A lot of African American clients I see, they don't really qualify under a DSM-5, which is like the mental health Bible that has all these diagnoses. A lot of them don't even qualify for those, but we know that there's some type of issue going on, right? A lot of folks have what we call adjustment disorders, which means we know there's a problem, but it's not as serious as a mental health issue as defined throughout this book. So that's the main thing. So, but that leads to other stuff. PTSD leads to PTSD, leads to depression. I would say probably the highest thing I see with a lot of my clients is anxiety. So they have a high anxiety because they don't know what's going to happen next. There's a lot of worry, there's a lot of concern. So anxiety is pretty high. But for the most part, a lot of clients I see, they don't have official mental health disorders, but they do have issues that are causing them to seek counseling from somewhere or someone. Well, part of the mental health stigma has a historical trauma like linkage to it, right? So historically, therapy was never for African American people. It never was. As a matter of fact, therapy wasn't even for your common standard person in the United States. Therapy was for affluent white people, and mainly men, believe it or not, even though it's a female-dominated field at the moment. But it was for affluent white folks, and when it was introduced to African Americans, we were used as test subjects. So we had a lot of psychological testing going on, being electrocuted, having our brains examined, putting us into torturous situations to see how the behaviors would function. So we were always kind of like guinea pigs and lab rats when it came to psychology. So that's part of the stigma. We have this historical lineage of being mistreated by the association of psychology that was governed by our politics. Also, it's coupled with the distrust in the medical system, because medically we've been experimenting on. A lot of people know about the Tuskegee experiment. That's kind of the one that's put out there. But there's been tons of other things. You know, forced sterilization, neutering black males, people taking out our teeth and using them for other people. George Washington had his teeth made by, slaves, like things like this. Historically, we just don't trust medical places. And even that continues on to now, because we have always been kind of test subjects and forced to having our bodies manipulated for the better good of mostly white folks at the time, and that carried on. It never stopped. There was never a point of contention where we were like, okay, this is too much, we need to stop. That stuff is still happening. I mean, there's been sterilization cases that have been brought up as early as like 2003. So these things are very, very well still alive. And the stigma, it's not like black folks just don't want to go to therapy. There's a reason behind that. So that's one area I would say. The second area I would say is there's limited information on what mental health and therapy really is. In the black community, there is a huge notion that mental health therapy is for crazy people, right? And we have this broad brush of what crazy is for everybody. And that's not technically what it is. Now, I get what we say when we talk about people being crazy. Like, these are behaviors, these are thoughts, these are things that people are verbalizing that we don't hear on a daily basis. But that doesn't necessarily mean someone is crazy. In fact, I think that we need to go to therapy. I think that black folks should have free therapy for life because of the things that we've experienced in the United States. I really do. I think that it should be a cultural standard for us to have, like, in reparations, free therapy, because we have had such a traumatic experience in this world, really, but especially in the United States, that it's something that we need. So we don't have a lot of information on what therapy actually is. So we need that. The third thing I would say is that we also don't have enough providers that of color, right? I'm a black male therapist. I'm a unicorn. There's not a lot of me, and if you find one of us, it's really hard to track us down, because since there's not a lot of us, we're super busy, and especially in a state like Minnesota, a lot of black male therapists are in administrative positions because there isn't a lot of us, and we do a lot of different things to try to repopulate and try to put us out there. So that's just males, right? And when you include females, there's still not enough of us. And then if you start looking at other black populations, like Somali populations, there's not a lot of Somali therapists out there either. Growing field for a lot of folks, but still not enough. We don't have a lot of Muslim therapists as well. There's black populations, whether they're immigrants or not, who are Muslim, and they want some Muslim counselors as well. We don't have enough of those either. So it's a field that really needs to take kind of a look at itself and say, what can we do to bring in more people of color, especially because we know that these folks have needs. And I think that that's not just a community thing to say, hey, we want to push forward some of our best and brightest young people to go into this field, but also the field should be saying, hey, we need to go get some of these folks and recruit them. Because I know tons of people, when I went to undergrad, tons of people of color who got degrees in social services or liberal arts or whatever. Those degrees can easily be translated into psychologists. Unfortunately, you have to go and get a master's degree to get licensed and all that, and a lot of black folks don't take that extra step into education. But I think that in order for that to happen, there needs to be a push on both ends, community and the industry at the same time. So those are my three reasons for the stigma. Yeah. One thing that's important to know is that black folks have always found a way to survive. I think we are some of the best people when it comes to what we call survival stress management. We know how to survive. We're some of the most stressed out people too, don't get me wrong. But we will continue to try to make a way out of any or nothing or anything we can. So that's kind of built into our cultural DNA, is to keep going, keep pushing, is what we would say in my culture, right? However, even with that, some of the ways that we have utilized as a collective to cope haven't been the most healthy. We do have a lot of healthy things, but there's some things that aren't healthy that we have to be honest about and to talk about amongst ourselves as community members, and say, sometimes we can't just go to our spiritual places to get all the healing that we need. We can't just go to church, right? That's a piece of the puzzle. It's not the puzzle, right? We can't just go to the mosque or synagogue, and we can't just go to grandma or whoever the family member is who has the most stability in their lives. Like, that's not enough for the issues that we're dealing with. And sometimes I think that that's what we do. Another thing that we do when it comes to resiliency is we keep a lot of things to ourselves too, which is probably the most hurtful thing, because it leads to all these other ways to cope with our pain or our stress. So we have high levels of, smoking marijuana, drinking alcohol, violence, whether that's interpersonal violence or violence on ourselves. We have a lot of issues with the tobacco usage, like all these things that lead to like really bad health outcomes later. We tend to cope with because those things feel good, right? With those things feel good. Even things like sex, sex is a thing, food is a thing too. We overindulge in a lot of things that if we have too much of or we don't do safely can hurt us later on. But the good things that we do is we can organize when we desperately need to. I think sometimes we wait way too long to organize. We probably should have some more proactive responses to things instead of reactive responses. But we can organize when the pressure is on. We can organize. What else for resiliency? Resiliency, I think, is something that gets thrown around a lot as a term too, and I think that it doesn't always get interpreted the same depending on who you're talking to or where you're talking to people. Because I do see the African American community. I see my community is very resilient in what we're doing. Like, it's a miracle that we're even still here. There's been populations in this world that have been wiped out that haven't been through half the things that we've been through, and we're still here. So I think that that's important to recognize, just the strength and even maintain in a culture, no matter how good or bad the culture may seem. There is a kind of a fountain of pride there that we should draw from to say, hey, we are still here. But our culture does need work at the end of the day. Like, we need tons of work. I've dedicated my life's work into trying to help benefit that as much as I can, but I can't be one of 10 voices doing it. Like, we all need to be kind of on the same page and pushing the boat forward for the collective. So yeah. For mental health first aiders, I would say, number one, make sure that you are in a comfortable place with your own stress. All right, your own trauma, your own stuff. You cannot help anybody if your stuff is spilling over into the work that you're trying to do. That's number one. Even for myself, I've had to do a lot of work, and I still do a lot of work because I've experienced a lot of trauma. And my trauma is not healed. I don't look at healing as a destination. I look at healing as a journey. And I think a lot of times we say, okay, we're going to do healing circles, or we're going to get this person therapy and they're going to be fine, and not understanding that this coping is a process, and this notion of healing is a process to keep going. So understand, one, you got to deal with your own stuff. Two, healing is definitely not a destination, it's a journey. And three, you're not going to solve everyone's problems in your interaction. People have to do their own work. So one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn as a therapist is that I can help someone develop tools. I can help someone, shift kind of their paradigm in life or their thought process. I can lay out a plan that I think will make their lives, grander if they just did in 3 months. But at the end of the day, they still have to take action and do something for themselves, whether that's something they develop with me or not. And knowing that you may not be the person that's going to have the hugest impact on their lives. You may open up a possibility for someone else to do it, which is a huge benefit and a great way to think about it, because it can be difficult working with any population, especially African Americans, because there's so many factors at play in our mental health that it's hard to just say if we do X, Y, and Z, your life's going to get better, because something else can happen, or there's these other lingering issues that you are not aware of that pop up or trigger or become active in this person's life, and then you're kind of like starting over from square one. So just being there and taking the time to work with somebody may open up possibilities for someone else down the line, or themselves down the line, to keep moving forward for themselves. So it can be kind of tiring at times. It can be very stressful on yourself when you're helping and you're laying out things and you see things differently, but the person or the people that you're working with may not be doing, they may not be making the progress that you expect them to make with the plans that you guys have together. And sometimes people just got to reach that place on their own. And that's okay to understand that as a helper or a first aid. Yeah. For white providers, one thing when I go out and I train white providers, I make it a point to say, like, being a white person is going to automatically put you in a position of authority, no matter if you're licensed or not. You can be Joe Blow who lives next door, and due to the historical nature of this country, you're going to be automatically put into an authoritative position. It's important to be honest about that. You may feel uncomfortable about it, but that's just where we are in society. And since that puts you in a position of authority, you have a choice to make, right? It may be an uncomfortable choice, but you have the choice to make is how much help can I actually give this person without harming this person. And one thing that, when I say harming, it might not be physically harm, it may be emotional or social harm that you can cause this person. One thing that happens a lot of times with white providers is that they expect the client, the black client, to educate them on the issues that are going on for this black person or for black people in general. And I think that that's putting a lot of pressure on the person that's coming for help to educate you. We have enough resources, one being YouTube. You can learn enough about black culture on YouTube, positive and negative stuff, where you can do a lot of this self-work yourself. Netflix has tons of documentaries for you to learn enough of this. And saying that you feel so bad because you didn't know, I think that we live in an information age where ignorance is a choice. So if you feel like you need to learn about culture, you can call a professional like myself, and I can kind of help do what I can do, or you can seek out that knowledge yourself. And I think that's the best way, is when you're actually seeking it out for understanding just what's going on. There's so much material out there, good stuff to help educate folks. It's hard to say that I did not know.